Welcome to the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, presented by the Beef Cattle Research Council, the most popular content from beefresearch.ca, available on the go. Before we get into this week's episode, a quick message from the BCRC.
Carrying capacity is the amount of forage available for grazing animals in a specific field. Accurately calculating it is crucial for setting the right stocking rate, ensuring animal productivity, and maintaining grassland health. The BCRC Carrying Capacity Calculator offers two methods for calculating the carrying capacity of your pastures to help maximize efficiency. Explore this resource and learn about the steps involved in these two methods by clicking the link in the show notes. This episode is titled Food Safety and features the BCRC's Science Director, Dr. Reynold Bergen.
Hi there, I'm Reynold. This Research on the Record article originally appeared in the May 2025 issue of Canadian Cattleman magazine, and it's been reposted on the beefresearch.ca site with the publisher's permission. Today we're going to talk about how food safety is rocket science. Food safety problems related to Canadian beef rarely make the news these days, and that's because they hardly ever happen. But that hasn't always been the case. Canada's food safety has come a long way over the past century. Drs. Yang from Agriculture Canada and Lacombe and Dr. Sanford from the University of Lethbridge recently published a review article about the progress that Canada's made on beef safety, and their scientific paper is linked in the online version of this article if you want to read that for yourself. So we'll start at the beginning. Back in the 1920s, nearly 15% of Canadian children died before the age of 2 because of a variety of milk-borne diseases. So those include bovine tuberculosis and brucellosis. Now, when they introduced pasteurization, that effectively dealt with those problems. Bovine tuberculosis can also be transmitted through undercooked beef, but it's virtually impossible to effectively pasteurize different beef cuts because they vary so much in size and thickness. So instead, back in the 1920s, they would identify potentially infected beef based on the presence of tuberculous lesions in the head or chest or internal organs of cattle at slaughter. But aside from that, beef safety was largely based on, the idea that if it looks bad or if it smells bad or if it tastes bad, you probably shouldn't eat that. Now, Canada began to track foodborne disease in the 1970s, but back then limitations in diagnostic tests and labs and stuff meant that the microbe that was actually responsible for a food safety problem was only identified about 20% of the time. So that spurred the development of Canada's foodborne disease reporting system. Because if you can quickly and accurately identify pathogens in sick patients, then you can greatly increase the ability to quickly trace cases of foodborne illness to the initial source. But responding to problems isn't nearly as good as preventing them from happening in the first place. So that actually brings us to the space race. So the idea here is that when you take 2 or 3 astronauts and you put them in diapers and then cram them into a space capsule for a couple of weeks at a time, and there's no doctor with them, it's really, really important to make sure that they don't get food poisoning. So initially, back in the day, in the 50s, NASA set really strict limits for microbial numbers, and they set rigorous testing requirements that had to be achieved before food would be approved for use in the space program. But the problem was that hardly any food passed those standards. And so after throwing an awful lot of food away, NASA decided that ensuring food was safe after it had already been produced wasn't going to work. It was the food production process itself that needed to be improved. And so oddly enough, they found the solution to this in their rocket building manuals. Because, of course, early rockets couldn't be fixed in mid-flight, and so that meant they had to assemble everything perfectly, and everything had to function properly every single time. That meant paying extremely close attention to every detail of the rocket manufacturing process. And so that's what they decided to do with food too. And NASA worked with the Pillsbury Food Company to adapt that prevention-based approach to food production for the space program. So they identified every point in the production process where food could potentially be contaminated, and they developed effective ways to prevent or control those potential contamination points, and they monitored them continuously, and they kept meticulous records, and that process worked. So far, no NASA astronaut has ever gotten food poisoning in space. So back here on Earth, things have changed considerably since the early days of the space program, and our leading food safety concern in Canadian beef now is Shiga toxin-producing E. coli. That's also called S-tech, and those are things like E. coli 0157H7. So those bacteria first showed up in Canada in the early 1980s, and human cases of S-tech associated illness generally doubled every year through the 1980s. So S-tech are a problem because they don't cause disease in animals, so there's no lesions to look for at slaughter, and they're invisible to the naked eye, so you can't see them by looking at the carcass. And it only takes 10 of these bacteria, 10 individual bacteria, to cause a person to get sick. And so that means that random food safety testing is going to be ineffective as well, because you're trying to find an invisible needle in a really big haystack. And so when the first big S-tech outbreak killed 4 children and infected 732 other consumers in the US in 1993, North American regulators in the food industry responded by adopting and implementing NASA's approach to food safety. So they identified critical control points and developed solutions to address potential food safety hazards. And these have essentially eliminated S-tech from beef carcasses. So among other things, the processes they developed to combat S-tech and other pathogens include hide-on carcass washes and really strict skinning and evisceration procedures and carcass and trim sprays and really precise temperature control. And they fine-tuned their sanitation of conveyor belts and cutting equipment and gloves and everything else. So in the late 1990s, E. coli 0157H7 infections affected 8 in 100,000 Canadians. That number dropped by half, so to 4 in 100 by the early 2000s, and it's dropped a bunch since then to 1 in 100,000 by 2010. So NASA developed the principles, but the specific solutions that have proven to be effective for beef processing plants were developed by food safety researchers. So that brings us to today. Our prevention-based food safety systems are very effective when they're implemented and operated properly. But pathogens still do sneak through from time to time, which is why ground beef needs to be cooked to 71 degrees Celsius. Now, researchers suspect that bacteria are hiding in hard-to-clean areas in the processing facility. So when they do that, so if they find a little crevice underneath a conveyor belt or someplace, these bacteria can establish colonies called biofilms. And a biofilm is like a shell that can resist a pressure washer, and they can resist a lot of sanitizers. So they're really hard to clean, and they're invisible as well. But they can periodically release pathogens back into the environment that can go on to recontaminate beef as it moves through the plant. And so what does all this mean to you? Well, food safety underpins consumer confidence and demand for Canadian beef. Canada's researchers are developing effective solutions to help prevent food safety problems from arising, and the checkoff you pay as a producer helps to fund that work. The bottom line is that the more we learn, the more we know, and the better we can do. Yesterday's research underpins today's safe beef, and today's research will help avoid problems tomorrow. Canada's researchers are currently putting a lot of focus on biofilms, and what they're learning from that will improve food safety, but it goes beyond food safety. It also has implications for on-farm biosecurity and animal health. So you'll have to stay tuned for more. But thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. You can find all relevant links and information at beefresearch.ca or in the show notes. The Beef Cattle Research Council is funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and strives for excellence in the production of Canadian beef, cattle, and forage through research, innovation, and extension. Tune in every Tuesday as the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast delivers straightforward insights, expert information, and a wealth of practical knowledge for Canadian beef producers. Subscribe now.